Hello, and welcome to this special event brought to you by Court International Festival of Literature in partnership with One World Publications and Dubray Books. I'm Sasha Boyle, Director of Court, and I'm so pleased today to be introducing this event with Galway homegrown talent, Caoilinn Hughes. Caoilinn will be speaking today about her latest novel, The Wild Laughter, which was released just a few weeks ago. We'll have a chance to hear a bit about the book, and then she'll be joined in conversation by none other than Kevin Barry. I'll give a little introduction now, and then we'll hand over to Caoilinn and Kevin for the main event. Caoilinn Hughes is the author of 2 novels and 1 collection of poetry, Gathering Evidence. Her debut work of fiction, Orchid the Wasp, won the Collyer Bristow Prize, was shortlisted for the Hearst Big Book Awards, the Butler Literary Award, and was longlisted for the Authors Club Best First Novel Award. Her work has appeared in Granta, Poetry, Tin House, Best British Poetry, BBC Radio 3, and elsewhere. She has a PhD from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand and was recently the visiting writer at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. The Wild Laughter is her latest book. Kevin Barry is the author of the novels Nightboat to Tangier, Beetlebone, and City of Bohan, as well as the short story collections There Are Little Kingdoms and Dark Lies the Island. Nightboat to Tangier was longlisted for the 2019 Booker Prize and was named one of the New York Times top 10 books of 2019. City of Bohan was awarded the International Dublin Literary Award in 2013. His new collection of short stories, That Old Country Music, will be published in October. Thanks so much for joining us today, and please give a warm, socially distant welcome to Caoilinn Hughes and Kevin Barry.
Thank you very much, Sasha, for the introduction, and it's great to do this today for Court and to launch Caoilinn's absolutely wonderful, tremendous second novel, The Wild Laughter. I think, Caoilinn, you're going to give us a quick blast from the start of the book.
I will, yes, thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and thank you, Sasha. So I'm just going to read from the opening couple of pages. Oh, I need my glasses. I'm squinting at myself here. Imagine a 30-ish Roscommon man. The night the chief died, I lost my father, and the country lost a battle it wouldn't confess to be fighting. For the no-collared, labouring class, for the decent, dependable patriarch, for right of entry from the field into the garden. Jurors were appointed to gauge the casualty. They didn't wear black. Don't they know black is flattering? The truth isn't. They kept safe and silent. I didn't. When is a confession an absolution, and when is it a sentencing? I'd like to find out. I suppose there's only one outcome for souls like us, heavy-going souls the like of mine and the long-lost chiefs, and not a good one. But I lay it on the line, if only to remind the people of who they are, a far cry from neutral judicial equipment. Determining the depth of rot that's blackening the surface can't always be left to deities and legislators. Sometimes what's needed is to tie a string around the tooth and shut the door lively. 2. He was a bright young thing, my brother, Cormac. His mind was a luxury. The face was rationed, it must be said, but there's not a body with everything. Part T-Rex, part pelican. Picture that menace of features. Close-eyed, limb-chinned, skin thick as the red carpet he imagined laid down beneath his wellies. Tall as the door he expected to be let in. When he was 12, he looked 20. The mind was ahead too, as I said. The odd girl went in for such a harrow of a fella, the odd girl, and not the even, on account of his brains and his chesty conduct. Not that he was liberal with his cleverness, but there was the atmosphere of it, knowing at any moment something you'd say would be turned inside out like a child's eyelid to traumatize you, to show you the violence behind it that you never meant. Or maybe you did. As I say, I didn't resent him his mind. Early on, its potential was fearsome, but he cached it away too long until it curdled. He could have his intellect. I had the looks, the chief's mud-coloured locks, yellowing now like a stack of cut grass drying out for haymaking. Hey, square skull, cultured nose, the kind of eyes that might be described as pea and mint soup, best served cold. I was shorter than my brother by a foot, but divvied up as good as David, I had the emotions of every girl in the County Roscommon over a barrel, a fact he found hard to swallow, in spite of, or maybe because of, the pelican chin. Excepting gobshites, I like people, and I was well liked, for no good reason far as Cormac was concerned. I'd zilch to contribute in the way of knowledge or guile or points for the home side, and sure, how else can a person be of use? Sport lent him an absence note for the farm work that needed doing, for the care work, for the life sentence. His absence meant my containment. Stay put, heart, he was telling me. Stay a mile wide of my circle. There's only so many circles in a town the size of a souterrain. What I did and said reflected on him, so he wanted the sticks brushed from my hair. He wanted the charm wiped off my face. He wanted me capable of summing sums and changing tyres. To be mad on mechanics, Newtonian and Fordian both. To know a stock option hadn't to do with cattle. But I wasn't after his or his boyo's approval, that panel of experts. Where we're from, infants get swaddled in Hessian sacks. I never bought into an alternative reality, no matter how low the interest rates limboed for the new millennium, no matter how you could go the whole way to Dublin on a test drive, and if you weren't satisfied, no one would lambaste you or demand a tenner for petrol. Cormac did clinch a deal with the new reality. Nothing daft. He didn't barter his youth, as many did, for a barge on the Shannon, or a conservatory extension, or an interior decorator, or a rotary milking parlour, or a personal stylist. No, he wanted a college education, a new way of life, less like subsistence, one that didn't stink of fear and survival, a challenge that called for grey matter and not grunt work. He did fast maths on how the island was transfiguring. One of them scenarios, like if a train is going at such and such a pace in the direction of the stone wall, but it's absolute gas crack on the train, what are your options? Thanks.
It's sounding great, Caoilinn. Sounds fantastic. Are we going to get an audiobook at some point?
There is an audiobook.
Hey.
There is. It's coming out. It's Chris O'Dowd is narrating it.
Really? That's fantastic.
Yeah, because he's a Roscommoner, so there needed to be.
Yeah, played in goals for the minors, didn't he? For Roscommon at one point.
Did he? I didn't know that.
It was great footage. Yeah. Listen, Caoilinn. At the best of times, publishing a novel is a psychodrama, putting it out into the world. But this year, it must be especially trying at a mental and physical level with the whole pandemic and the lockdown and all that. You were postponed by a couple of months, weren't you?
I was, yeah.
Yeah, and how's it been? It's added more intensity to the whole publication process, I suppose.
I don't know. I experienced the first one so badly that anything is better than that.
What happened?
I was just too anxious and too in my head, and I found the process of publication really difficult because I don't really like to lose people money. And I became I was quite confused, so I don't have an MFA. I didn't kind of come from a network, a community of writers. I was kind of floating around on my own. And so I didn't really know what to expect. Not that you ever really do as a debut author, but I was conflicted and confused by the extent to which a novelist or a writer has to pause their writing life to become a kind of promoter, because the whole business is made up largely of small businesses who are struggling. So it's not as if it's a kind of even a commercial thing or a corporate thing, or it's just the sense that it's so hard to help a book, and I felt an obligation, but it didn't work either.
Yeah, like it's funny, like you write a book with your nerves as much as anything, don't you? And I heard a great description of publishing a novel. I can't remember who said it, but it said that, like you crawl out of a car crash and people start holding up scorecards. It's kind of what it feels like. But listen, you have to arrange your face for some praise now, because I need to talk a little bit about the novel. I think it's absolutely fabulous book. It's one of the two best novels I've read in the last year, I think. The other one is Hilary Mantel, so I'm putting you in very, very, very high standing. Like the story, it's a bankrupt farm in County Roscommon in 2008. The chief, the dying patriarch, is slowly fading, is heading for the grave. His two sons, Cormac and Hart, are trying to figure out what comes next and how to get there. Like, the story is great and it's urgent and it's fantastic, but what makes the book for me is the style in which it's written. There's a lovely kind of a looseness and freedom to the prose and to the syntax. I often find when that sort of freedom and looseness seems to be in the prose and in the style on the page, it takes an awful lot of work on the writer's part to get there. Was it long in gestation, the novel? Was that style kind of ready to go as you started writing it, or did you have to work towards it?
Thank you. I am one of I'm in the camp of writers that writes pretty much just one draft, or and maybe does the years of editing, but the first sentences usually stay the same. The plot, everything is the same. So I write kind of slowly. I'm a very slow reader also, and so I tend to be work once I bring this up all the time, but it's such a useful analogy. Zadie Smith has an essay about the two different camps of writers, and the micro managers and the macro planners, and she describes it as, and there's a spectrum, but in general you either are one of the two. You either kind of, if you use the analogy of a house, you lay the foundation and you put in the kind of the carpeting, and as soon as you're putting the bricks up, you're mortaring them and you're plastering them and you're painting them. So by the time you've gotten halfway up the house, there's paintings on the wall, and you would never really unravel it. You might change things a little bit and tighten it and improve the durability, but as opposed to the other macro kind of planner who writes rough drafts and will kind of have a blueprint, and they might kit out one of the rooms upstairs before they even have a stairwell, and they can kind of move things around very easily and introduce new rooms and and remove them, and so what they start out with, the blueprint might be very different from the final product, and so I kind of mention it just because if you don't hear this when you're a young writer, you might listen to writers talking about their method and feel like a fraud, because they're very different. It's a very different way of writing, and I've only known how to write one sentence at a time, and so I'm very, very slow at the beginning of a work, because I suppose a lot of the subconscious work is being done then. The tone is everything. The tone of a story, or, it's the first sentence, there's already 1,000 choices that have been made. And I kind of think of a novel or a story as, say you get a big piece of Connemara marble, if you're lucky. It could just be granite. And all you have, at the beginning is an axe. So when you have to make a gesture at some point. But in my process, that gesture can never ever be reversed. So you can't glue anything back on. And so it's terrifying. So there's a lot of stalling at the beginning. It's very, very hard to start something. That said, the editing process, once something is complete, can go on. And this is 8 years in the making, this book. So it's all of it is the same, except for I consider this editing, but I turned it into a novella. So I cut 40,000 words, and then and I snuck it in with a bunch of short stories to show my agent. And he just said, I just said, I'm sorry, it's not a story collection. And I said, okay, I've always asked him to hold me to a high standard. And he said, no, what are you doing smuggling in a novel in? And then I kind of explained that it had been a novel. And he said, can I see it? And I said, no, it's deleted. Anyway, and so I then kind of expanded it from then. But it's still, I can still consider that part of the editing, because nothing really changed of the style, of the tone, of the voice, of the sentences even.
Well, when you hit on the tone early on like that, it is the critical thing, as you say. Would you say that your unit of building work is the sentence rather than a paragraph or the scene? Do you go along line by line, sentence by sentence?
I do, yeah. And this novel was different to Orchid, because with Orchid and the Wasp, I was very much thinking in scenes. I kind of was trying to play into a strength there, in that I'm not very good at summary, you know. I'm not very good at managing a novel. So, but I feel I can do our scenes. Maybe I have a background in theatre, and maybe that's partly it. I've kind of visualized everything. And so that novel is actually comprised only of scenes. There might be 5 or 10 sentences in the whole book that summarize bits in between, but so the reader really has to glean all the information from observing things taking place. And this book, obviously, The Wild Laughter, is different because it's first person. So it arrived more as a monologue. And yes, so it was more sentence by sentence. Yeah.
Do you ever get the sense when you're writing, especially when you're writing a first person story, and when you're somebody who operates naturally at the level of the sentence as your building block or unit, do you ever get the sense, and it's almost one of these kind of magical, mystical things about writing fiction, that the story is there to be discovered, that it's already there, and if you can just hear it sentence to sentence, it'll put it. So it's, I guess what I'm saying is, you kind of have to give over some sort of mysterious trust to the process almost, and say, if I keep my ear to it, it's going to work out.
Yeah, for me, like, it's not as, I wish it was as passive as, and that's not to disparage anyone who has the joy of that, of being the case that they can just listen. I need to actively get myself out of the way. I find whenever I have writer's block, and I have it all the time, it's a kind of a sick feeling. And I can't name it, and I go around the place and, like, I tear my hair out literally, and I have all these scratches on my back like the black swan. I try and sell it well to my partner, but, like, the state of my back is the state of the story, because I just scratch away. But and always what it is I made a dishonest decision, and I have to find it. So I have to unravel to the point where that it might be that I put a line of dialogue in a character's mouth that actually was just convenient for the scene, or sounded good, and those are the things that break stories for me. So it can often take me a long time to find that.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? In your heart and soul something has gone wrong, but it can be very hard to pinpoint exactly where you kind of lost the thread, and where, and it can take months before you figure out where the ear failed. For me, is what it is, and often it goes back to the kind of tonal thing. I think with The Wild Laughter, it's the chief's slow and painful demise as we go on through the story. That's what really pins us to the book as readers emotionally. Was it kind of to make this portrait of the chief in his dying days? Was it sorrowful kind of work?
Well, I mean, it is in a larger sense, in that this is a character who is quite melancholy and morose, but and maybe it's quite self-pitying. But at the same time, makes decisions and has opinions and acts in certain ways that are his own undoing. And I was interested in that in the context of the Irish, all of the rural repressed Irish bachelors dreaming of America, that kind of lineage. But also he's kind of a gregarious in another way, and he does have a control. He's at least exerting control of this narrative, which maybe he feels that is being denied to him by the culture, and by his family life, and he's insisting upon a certain narration, and that's one of the themes. So that wasn't a kind of a tragic note when I was writing it, because I was trying not to judge. I just wanted to hear him out and trust that the story that he was telling was worthy of being told, because that's all he was asking.
When stories about Ireland, stories especially about rural Ireland, are forever kind of hovering and circling around, these endless themes about land and families and repression and all of this stuff. And it can be daunting to come to that, because you think, how in the name of Jesus am I going to bring some freshness to this. Does your poet's ear come into that in any way? And how you're going to bring freshness to the material? How you're going to make it new on the page, or do you concentrate on the level of characters?
I think character and language are the things that I feel less of a fraud with, whereas plot and that kind of thing, it doesn't come naturally to me. And I watch a lot of TV. I love contemporary TV. It's just there's so much good stuff being written, and in particular TV, even in comparison to film. And I'm in awe of people who can do that, because you do need to have a mastery of plot in a way that I don't feel that I have. But I do feel fairly confident that if I spend it, that I can write characters that maybe haven't been written before, partly out of my own obsession to be, I guess, in this fraud kind of narrative, my biggest fear would be that I would try and be self-flattering. So I'm always going to try and write into the uncomfortable areas and not kind of necessarily meet characters with comeuppance or redeem them in an obvious way, or have them come to certain realizations that the reader will come to. I do think I'll probably lose readers for that, because they'll find that difficult, and it definitely happened with Orchid. As to whether or not it will with this, I don't know, because it's first person. He has more of it's more likely that people will empathize, because he's kind of telling his own sorrowful story.
It's interesting when you say that plot doesn't feel natural to you. I feel that very much as well. But I mean, plot isn't natural to humans. Lives are essentially plotless, and you do watch these amazing television dramas that seem to be so expertly structured and plotted. And you have to remember that there are 14 very gifted writers in a room, usually, behind these. And like the misfortunate novelist on the solo mission can compete with that. Increasingly, I kind of feel like Aidan O'Brien says the plots are for Boy Scouts. Worry about your characters and be true to the characters and be true to the situation and be true to the setting and the place. Can I ask why Roscommon specifically? I'm looking out the window behind the screen at it, and I have to bring you up on some factual details in a while. But
oh really? Oh my God!
Just about rainfall amounts. But apart from that, why is the setting Roscommon? Do you have any background up here, or is it?
I'm from Galway, and I'm from the country. And
whereabouts, Caoilinn?
On the way to Tuam.
Okay.
Knockdoe it's called. But I needed somewhere that was landlocked. The first kind of image that I had of the novel was which was abandoned. Just the feeling of that dynamic was what made me feel I had a novel, was of Nora, this farming mother, looking through a keyhole at her adult son who is living at home, and to check if he's kind of dead, because there's something that they've been unable to tackle. And that was the kind of the dynamic, the feeling that I had at the beginning. And I remember telling a writer, a friend of mine, and who I played poker with in New Zealand, that this image, I felt like I should write a novel. And he said, no, that sounds really bad. But he was right. Like, the scene didn't stay, but it was the feeling of claustrophobia. So I couldn't have really set it on a coast. It had to be, and also because I didn't really know myself whether Nora, the mother character, had ever seen the sea, and that was going to be quite important to me. There are things about her character that aren't in the book, because Hart, the protagonist, so dreadfully fails her, in his ability to know her. So I needed a landlocked place. I needed to be similar to the kind of territory that I grew up in, very flat around where I grew up, and there were a lot of dogs, and there is a kind of an echo in the book with the Caoilinn myth, who, was Cullen's hound when he accidentally killed King Cullen's hound. He offered to replace the hound, so it means Cullen's hound, Cuchulainn. And then he was destined, this demigod, destined to have a short but heroic, life for all of the books. And then he on the way to battle, he's offered dog meat, but this is a taboo because eating dog meat is a taboo, but so is it a taboo to refuse hospitality. So he's in a catch-22, and so he eats the dog meat, and then he goes to battle, and he suffers a wound in his stomach, and a deadly wound, and he carries his intestines into him to go and find a standing rock, and then he ties himself to the standing rock so that he can die standing up. But so there, he kind of is like, so there was this. This wasn't very conscious in the writing process, but I felt that somehow this kind of flatland with a lot of dogs and a rural, and farmland in the arena made sense. And then Roscommon was just, and then I found a place called Dysart, and it just...
Isn't it interesting though, just to make it Roscommon and not Galway, freeze it a bit in your mind as a writer, just to move it 50 miles up the road kind of a thing. Gives you more license almost in a funny way.
Very much so.
Yeah. By the way, the technical Roscommon detail is you claim 175 days of rain a year. 292 is what I'm looking out the window at.
Really?
292 days in a week. Is it any wonder the pros to be in the condition it's in with that level of rainfall for them? Do you think? I people sometimes ask, where does all the great Irish writing come from? And it sounds like a pat answer, but I often say the weather. Do you think our climatic conditions, especially in the west of Ireland, have an impact on your prose style?
I think if there's any truth in that, it's probably the fact of staying indoors, and that's just a pragmatic outcome maybe of the weather. But I also think so much of it has to do with kind of funding and even if it isn't the funding for the arts hasn't been nearly what it should have been for the last decade or so. There's a cultural capital with writing. It's kind of respected and appreciated in a way that maybe it isn't in other countries. I lived in New Zealand for a long time, and the Prime Minister, there was a kind of obnoxious, if I'm allowed to say that without getting sued, Prime Minister before the wonderful one now, and he, all of the focus went on rugby and on sports, and not really interested in writing. And when the Eleanor Catton won the Booker with the Luminaries, the second time ever a New Zealander had won, she was quite critical of New Zealand, of some of the structures in New Zealand politics and society, as all writers are. We're all, we're all a bit critical. It's part of our role. And he came on, he did an interview on TV, the Prime Minister, where he said writers should stay out of politics. This is a Prime Minister telling an author who's just brought so it was a bizarre dynamic where you can't imagine something like that happening, I think, in Ireland. And hopefully it wouldn't happen now with the new Prime Minister they have. So that's a country to country thing. It does change quite a lot. And I just feel like I've been at events, I did a Sydney Writers Festival last year, and only then did I really feel like Orchid and the Wasp had come out. I'd never been able to have the conversations that I had about the book then, and it was so meaningful to me. And I was there because of Culture Ireland, and I don't think there was, Culture Lithuania or, Culture Estonia. I don't think there were. So I know it's relative, the funding thing, but it does feel really important. It's what gains a lot of the global kind of capital or kind of appreciation for Ireland as being a centre for writing.
It's interesting, really, when you say about this, like the fact of us being indoors a lot because it's raining, essentially, and that feeds into what this glorious kind of tradition in Irish kind of storytelling and narrative and all this mythology that comes in. And there's a great hare story in The Wild Laughter. what you want to talk about. But sometimes when what we talk of as literary fiction in quote marks, it can seem almost afraid of that Irish kind of mythology and that sort of magic that's out there. So I love that in The Wild Laughter, where it takes a lot of that in and it glances at it. Where did the hair story come from? Or did you make it up?
No, I had heard it. Yeah,
it's a really moving one. I collect hair stories. It's a really good.
Oh yeah, no, it is. And I mean, there's my dad's a great storyteller, but there was another one that Dad told about these two schoolboys who are doing an exam, and this isn't really I suppose it's to do with animals tangentially, and they're writing a paper on the sparrow, and the teacher sees the two of them, and at a certain point she realizes Micheál is copying off Owen, and he sends him to the other side of the room, and so when he's grading their papers, the Micheál's one and Owen's one are exactly the same for the first 3 of the 6 bullet points about the sparrow. It's a migratory bird. He travels from such and such. He has this kind of, and then the next one on Micheál's is he have a roundy head. And I remember, this is classic Dad story. But then I was in Belfast where I studied, and I heard Seamus Heaney gave a poetry reading. And he started telling the story about the sparrow, and I couldn't believe it. I felt just so affronted.
I heard that. I heard that story in Cork City in the late 90s, the roundy head, and it was presented to me by a friend as, "Oh, my girlfriend who's a school teacher in the class." So it's obviously one of these ones that just circulates,
I was just going to say that I think having had such an urban novel with the first one, and such a novel that was exploring cynicism, it allowed me to feel that I could indulge in or not be afraid that of that kind of more mythical heroic vibe.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sometimes think that I guess talking about influence. There's a John McGahern novel directly mentioned in the text at some point. Even more than something like McGahern, I would have heard an awful lot of Dermot Healy's anarchic kind of spirit as being somewhere in the book's genetic kind of influence as well, and Flann O'Brien and things like that. I guess what I'm saying really is a kind of a spirit of mischief in it, and the fact that the book is very funny. And sometimes, and I think this is more an issue often on the other side of the Atlantic in the US. It's like if a book is funny, it can't be serious, where surely the reverse is true. If a book is to be serious, it has to be funny at some stage.
I mean, I do like funny books.
Yeah. And you're a naturally funny writer. I mean, do you ever there's never the sense that you're trying to be funny in the book?
I'm not funny as a person. And I don't say that wanting a compliment. I'm not, and I was always the person who,
but the funniest people never think they're funny. That's the thing.
No, it's demonstrable from even our family WhatsApp. I come in with all of the grim facts, and then it's followed by just a series of GIFs and videos that all my siblings have made to kind of repair the timeline. That's my vibe.
You're the kind of voice of doom, are you?
Yes, 100%. But also, I mean, my memories of secondary school are mostly of laughing, peeing my pants, laughing. I did no learning, and I think I love other people's humor. It's kind of like the best thing about life to me, and so I feel, I guess, when you write, that you get to enjoy characters' sense of humor, and not all of them know that they have it. Or for example, in The Wild Laughter, Hart doesn't know how funny his mother is.
The mother, Nora, seems to be this kind of waft of a presence in the earlier parts of the book, but she comes more and more into it as the book goes on, and becomes in lots of ways the most significant presence in the book, I think. A lot of the way the characters are these kind of almost archetypal figures who then sort of clarify into detail as the book goes on. It reminded me a lot, and often writing about rural Ireland reminds me a lot of writing about the American South. In terms of, I'm thinking in terms of people like Flannery O'Connor and Faulkner and all of that. I think Irish rural writers and American Southern writers face a lot of the same problems. on the page, a lot of the same difficulties, especially in terms of the dialect and the idiom. And you want to do it justice and to do it faithfully, but also you don't want to seem to over-egg it. Is that a kind of a load of literature that you would have worked from at some point, sort of American Southern kind of stuff?
Yeah, and I do. I mean, I've taught Flannery O'Connor before. I find her so funny, but recently I've kind of recoiled a little bit, just learning some more. She really published some very racist nonfiction stuff. That does make me. I've always also been rankled a little bit at the religious intent, maybe, and you don't see it in some stories. I think in like A Good Man is hard to find, you don't see it, but then in other stories like Everything That Rises Must Converge, which these are stories that stop me in my tracks. So I guess I considered them more than I might a lot of others, and so I'm a little bit, I have to go back and consider her work, but Faulkner, absolutely, and I would have read quite a bit of. I didn't really come to novels until I didn't really read novels until I was kind of 18, and really not properly, until university. I read poetry and plays. And this was largely because I was a very slow reader, and I'm a slow learner, and slow processor. I found the novels to be very intimidating, and I felt that they were for somebody else. Maybe they were for my siblings, but they were, I would memorize the back of a book, because if Mum bought a book, she would want, several of us to read it. And I would get the side eye kind of from my sister, because she knew well what I was doing. I had no interest in reading them. I felt like there was so much to remember, and whereas poetry and plays had all of this blank space around them, and there was a lot of maybe just the right kind of books that I picked out, and maybe I felt that if you didn't understand it, it didn't really matter, because there'd be one image or one line that was so distinctive that it would root itself in you in some way, so that you gained something. Whereas a novel, I don't think I would have gained anything. I would have just, felt oppressed by it.
So your original writing impulse was towards poetry, and
it was, and it was because that's what I read. It wasn't really a decision. It was that's what I was reading. And then I moved to Northern Ireland to do my undergrad and MA, and to Queen's, and that's there was a huge community of poetry. Now they were there, but I didn't see them, but now there are kind of prominent fiction writers, Wendy Erskine and Jan Carson and Glenn Patterson, and there are as well as all of the poets like Sinead Morrissey and Stephen Sexton, all these people who were just in Leontia Flynn, and I was very conscious of the poetry and the wealth. Kieran Carson was there, it just felt like it was worth writing, and there were readers for it,
Yeah. Speaking as someone who gave up poems at the age of 15, I seeded the field. But is it something that continues for you? Are you continuing to write poetry and prose fiction side by side, or
I don't do anything side by side, unfortunately. I'm slow at everything, and I'm a kind of a monotasker. And I also kind of need a pause before I start anything new. So if I write a poem, that means I'm going to have 5 or 6 days where I don't write anything else before I can start. And it's not by choice. It's just, I'm banjaxed, and I manage to work occasionally. But I never really, this is probably something that my poetry publisher wouldn't like me to hear me saying, I never really felt like I was trying to write poetry. I never really felt, and I kind of put a book together, but, and it allowed me it gave me, it got me out of, I was working for Google. I had no connections to anything literary. And the fact of winning the Patrick Kavanagh for a collection of poems, then there was this kind of opportunity to publish a book, and that gave me license to remember what I wanted to be doing, and to not waste too much time trying to, save some money, to be able to do it. But I really feel like the only thing in life I don't feel like a fraud at, is fiction. And I wish that wasn't the case. I still do write the odd poem.
Yeah, you draw as well, don't you, Caoilinn? You draw.
But again, so I went. I finished school at 16, not because of ingenuity. I didn't get the grades to go to university. I didn't actually have enough to go to anywhere in Ireland. That's why, in the Republic, that's why I went to Queen's, because they only count 2 of your grades. And I actually didn't have the grade. I didn't even have 2 grades that were enough. I had a B- in English. But I brought in a bunch of poems that I'd had published in the magazines, and they made an exception. And I've lost track of your question now. You'd asked me about painting. Yeah, so I did. Yeah. After school, I spent a year, just because I hadn't gotten in anywhere. I spent a year going to kind of a foundation course in art, in fine art. What you would do for the start of an art degree in GMIT, and I was really bad at it, and it was so brilliant to be just bad, and to see other people who are good, and it made me just maybe that's part of what made me a writer, because I knew that I wasn't going to be comparable as a visual artist.
It's amazing freedom, isn't it? I draw a bit as well, but I draw like very badly and very slowly. But it's great because it's something creative that I'm not trying to be great at. You know what I mean? Yeah. When you're writing something at some level, okay, I'm bringing my A game here now, and I'm trying to be good. But it's a way of kind of, I think, channeling into your creative kind of subconscious in a way that's kind of unforced in a way, I guess. But it's the
absolute opposite. It's the absolute opposite of writing somehow. Making paintings or whatever. I think maybe music is closer to writing, but because I find visual art very far away from it, and that's what makes it kind of almost therapeutic if you're trying to get away from screens and typing and trying to put the words correctly adjacent. So I do find it now, just in lockdown, I've been kind of doing a little bit more of it. But I never hoped to be good.
Yeah. Do you speak Irish? Are you a Gaeilgeoir?
When I was in school, in secondary school, I was pretty good. But when I moved to Northern Ireland, I completely stopped. I was a little bit afraid in Northern Ireland I just wanted to observe the place, and I was so fascinated by it. And none of my siblings had ever been to Northern Ireland, and I wanted to enact observation and to not come with anything. Even my name, I was embarrassed of my name because it already brought so much with it. So I didn't want to speak Irish because the people there that spoke Irish, it seemed like a political stance. Yeah. So I really lost it. Yeah.
The chief in the while after puts in a lot of Irish here in the phrases and smatterings, and he's a Gaeilgeoir. Does it sometimes feel, this is something that I feel, that sometimes the English language is an unwieldy tool for an Irish way of seeing things. It's a very rational language, and we're a very irrational people. And that Irish writers to get a true style for their way of seeing on the page almost have to kind of beat it up a bit, and almost have to kind of break it down and kind of put awkward bits into it. Does any of that sort of to strike anything with you, any kind of resonance with you?
It does, yeah. Can I just ask, am I fuzzy?
No, not from this.
Okay. Yeah, it does. I guess I would answer this differently at different stages of my life. I speak Italian reasonably well. That's the only other language that I can kind of, speak. But living in the Netherlands, I'm very conscious of language, and when I've taught courses in translation, and one of the things that I teach, but now I realize I'm probably lying, is that these ideas that we have about the language that we speak, our native tongue. Some people will say, "Oh, Spanish is too soft and romantic and loving, and I can't write this kind of hard story that I want to write within that, so I'm going to write it in this other language," because in the Netherlands everyone speaks all of them. And I would kind of try and present that as a teacher to say that that's an association, because of naturally, if you, for example, you are polylingual, but all of your education was in German, you might find German to be, have this kind of an academic quality. And I try and kind of spend a little bit time thinking about that, but I can't help not being convinced. I'm not convinced by that, because, when I think about Dutch, it is so logical. Everything, like your Hoover is a stofzuiger, which means stuff sucker. Your saucer is an undertas, like everything is water koker is kettle. Everything is a meaning that is stitched together, and it makes it I would find it very hard to make that bend. To make that language bend.
Yeah, because Irish then is such a kind of wafty, poetical, mysterious kind of language, and it comes back to something I think in the book, the great Irish curse, I think, is this idea of respectability. Especially for people of the chiefs kind of generation, we have to be respectable people, and not only do we have to be respectable, we have to be seen to be respectable people. This is kind of one of the great torments, isn't it, that the book kind of hits on, especially in talking about this era around 2008 and 2000 and subsequently.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of the things that has come up for my last book and for this one in any kind of an international context, or even in England, is that the Irish crash was very distinct from all of the 2008 crash generally. And it was, but so I kind of will, quickly try and run through what made it distinctive, namely just that it was the largest bank bailout in human history, and that, but for me, I think not for me, I don't think it's subjective. What characterized it was the rapidity, so Ireland was so broke, post Second World War, just after independence, did pretty well with producing food and being neutral, and the price of food was so high, and there was that brief period of kind of, I suppose, hopefulness and employment. And then the 50s and 60s were so incredibly bleak, really up until the 80s, and I think there was another little kind of mini recession then. And then Ireland joining the EEC and, foreign direct investment, and Ireland becoming a hub for, 12.5% corporate tax rate, and deregulation of property and finance sectors, all of that coming together at the same time with investment of infrastructure from the EU, and kind of supporting indigenous companies. That all happened between the 90s and the early noughties. It was so rapid. And so to me, the scale of it, obviously, and the boom and collapse was so much larger. It was just so dramatic, going from being the poor man of Europe to being the highest, income per capita, one of the highest in the world. But the crash then, it was such a short period of the feeling that we might actually be able to self-govern, be able to be prosperous, be able to have what maybe the country felt other European countries had been enjoying, being able to travel without kind of needing to travel for the sake of jobs, the change in dynamic with emigration. All of that was so temporarily a salve for that little kind of, reservoir. I think it's of kind of self-loathing, and so wasn't there also the sense of Ireland and Irish people almost kind of enjoying the aspect of self-flagellation? That's exactly it. And you see, I would think that's got to do with this colonial history, and then after the colonial history, the church, the Catholic disciplinarian culture, and so it kind of came naturally that people would internalize, austerity as something that will return them to a state of morality, and that they need to become more self-disciplined. And this is something that I don't think is true. So the chief has internalized that, and suicide or anything like that is the absolute extreme version of that internalization. But then on the other hand, Nora's need to have her own ethics upheld within herself, even if it's a lie to herself. Like that has to do with what you were talking about respectability. And it's such, we would have hoped that it would be, that would have been something from the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
That was,
but no, it's still very there. You mentioned translation a few minutes ago, and it's there's going to be some great and unique challenges for translators of the Wild Laughter. I think if I was your Latvian translator now, for example, I'd be having some questions for you. There's a great one early on. I think it's the cousin Shane talking about his supposed romantic exploits. He says, "You have to throw some schnaz on it, lads." Miss Hughes, what is this word schnaz that you mentioned? Schnaz? What is schnaz? I have a theory. Is it coming from snazzy?
It is, yeah. It is. No. So far, I don't know if it's going to be translated into any language, which maybe is because of how difficult it is. But I mean, your own novels would have been incredibly hard to translate. So I'm not the worst. I'll point to you.
I've had nervous breakdowns reported to me by translators, but it's. Are you give us another blast from Caoilinn? Are you going to give us another short reading? We have questions coming in from viewers, so we'll go on to those after you give us another short blast from it, maybe.
Okay. Let me think.
Put a bit of schnaz in it. That's
Now you want schnaz. I feel like I need to do a different section. I was going to do a kind of an earnest bit. No, I will do the earnest bit because I'm not prepared, and otherwise we'll have too long of a delay. You can't downsize a potato field. Agus sé sin an five. Okay, I'll start again. There's a little phrase here, agus sé sin an five, and it means, and that's the problem. You can't downsize a potato field. Agus sé sin an five. The chief called from his tractor the following night when I went out with the sandwich. The chief's parents, who, as I said, were burnt to slags in a hay barn when he was a youth, were Gaeilgeoirs. He kept on the bit of Irish to honour them. I made my way along the mud bank towards him. I wanted him inside in the sitting room with the paper flopped across his wide lap like a dead stingray, and me sprawled sleepily on the couch, pretending to read Philadelphia, Here I Come. I wanted to get straight to the point with the chief, like the garrulous private, and make frantic recommendations to do with the properties. Wasn't there some poor illiterate creature who doesn't get out much, or who doesn't have the internet, who by some miracle doesn't know the home soil has gone to slurry, who'd happily lap up a villa in Malaga with a shared swimming pool and a dishwasher and motorised awnings and oversized tiles? Alternatively, wasn't there investing to be done now that we were all in the pits and could only crawl upwards? Wasn't it time to let go of this outmoded life? If we could sell something, I'd live without a kidney. I had my looks. Or arrange a county-wide poker championship for Cormac to work the odds of, with a Brobdingnagian brain on him, for us to win ourselves back, slowly but surely. What I ended up saying, holding out the sandwich, was, "There's lamb in that." He laboured out of the tractor. He was dragging a disc-type hiller behind for bringing up the earth to the potato vines. Though the engine was turned off its hoovering noise had fallen silent, the pattern of it carried on, the angled discs scooping up soil like a child's hands gathering sand to make a castle, the vines bowing down to let the tractor pass over them and then springing up behind, seeming renewed, devoted. Doing lines. We both squinted back down the length of the road that had been turned a deeper shade of earth, illumined by a flash of moonlight leading straight back to our lit house an acre off. "A manner of lines," he said. "I'll be doing it by hand before long, spraying pesticide one squirt at a time." He took the sandwich from me, out of a Mr. Muscle bottle. He winked and put the quarter of a sandwich in his mouth at once. Opportunities come in all ways and sizes, this time in the form of a stuffed gob. No, it was too soon. But then my mind was so filled with the large things I wanted to say, I was stuck for small ones. The chief chewed away and swallowed dryly. Never one to force talk, he was happy enough in his calm refueling. "We were back to school Tuesday. Tomorrow's off," I said. He made a noise of acknowledgement. Cormac's doing college stuff. He looked at me sideways, then spoke with a full mouth. Have you enough to be doing? I cringed suddenly at my school talk so late in the day. I'd scraped together 3 of the Leaving Cert subjects last year. You could help me widen the pond below, the chief said, almost optimistic. Drain out the wet year that's in it. Yeah, I'll do that. I want to do something, though. I don't know. Some variety of physical mastery would have been the thing to want, but I tried not to lie to him. I like making things, woodworking maybe, if I wasn't so tired from... I looked from field to sky to lay the blame elsewhere for my wreckery. Huge iron clouds blockaded the moon. Gandhi wouldn't have had the fortitude for stargazing in these parts. I heard the promising outbreath of a laugh. Home brewing's inevitable one of these days. But maybe I should take that fiddle down from the attic, learn to play a woeful recession tune. He grimaced. Woeful 'twould be. Don't be demanding fiddle lessons is all I'll say. I saw his hand go to his pocket in the gloom. Always on about the travel, you might take a look at your own country before scarpering off to Germany or Cambodia or wherever it is you're thinking. Walking's as good a pastime as any, to know yourself. There's history in these flatlands to fill a sizable mind, no elbowing tourists along the stone wall. I looked across to let him read my expression. Oh, I do forget about the dogs. He took in the last of the sandwich and didn't press me on it. I handed him a flask of grey tea in exchange for the kitchen towels. Then I gauged him lucid enough. We could declare bankruptcy. It was Cormac came up with it, so it'll be well thought out. The thing is, neither of us wants the farm, Dad. It's a good life, but Cormac's too arrogant for it. He said he will in his shite work for government subsidies. And you can go anywhere with a face like mine. I might meet a girl who won't want this. I'm thinking Australia sounds the job. And the thing is, if you go bankrupt, you could retire then. That was the point of the houses anyway, the whole mess. He had the mouthful long swallowed and was looking into the restless landscape, sporadically moon-lamped, as if the night was giving sign to a dangerous reef up ahead. He was 6'2" and had another year of standing to his full height, then a 5-year crash and collapse. You lads and your grand plans, he said, not to me, but to the hours of work ahead. I was glad not to have his gaze on me then. There was no way of knowing how wrong I'd been, but I was relieved not to have the idea strangled in my skull any longer. You can tell your brother your ideas are for lining the pockets of Morrigan and making them more self-righteous while you're at it. I tried to understand him, but it was a tone I hadn't heard. I guessed right that he wasn't talking bankruptcy. The brothers had slaughtered some lambs the night before in a metaphorical gesture. It was to get back at him, I said. The chief lifted his stubbled jowl, the cap shadowing his face. On the insurance, them lambs went, and Morrigan unable to sell them for the price he was asking, the fierce market that's in it. He was waiting till the last minute to get rid of them. He telephoned Jerry this morning, boastful of the Easter godsend. The chief would never have spoken so freely with Cormac. It was as if the night air and the waxy ears of his harmless youngest son were the particular conditions for talking. But I'd have gone ignorant just then. Like a gomy, I said, I'll do an hour for you now. I'm used to doing lines. He didn't smile, but threw the thermos into the tractor and hauled the new weight of himself up onto the seat. What ye lads don't understand. He stopped himself. But sure, why would ye? Who'd have taught you? The engine coughed up, and off he moved in his tired machinery, making lines as straight as humanly possible into the unknowable night.
Lovely stuff, Caoilinn. You're putting it up to Chris O'Dowd for the audiobook version, I think. Listen, we just have a few minutes left, I think, so I'm going to go to some of the viewers' questions. So this one is coming in from Matt in Galway, and it is a Galway-based question. It's given you are originally from Galway, what influence, if any, has Galway City and County, what influence has it had on you as a writer and as a poet?
As a Galway County, I spent really all my summers in Connemara growing up, and Connemara has come into my short stories quite a lot. Also, actually, there's a short story in the Galway Stories collection anthology by Durra Press which you should all get. It's really brilliant. But the anthology, not my story, and it was a really gorgeous thing to be part of. It prompted a story when I was having a rough time, so I was very, very grateful to be from Galway and to have the serendipity of that. But I think probably it affected me in all sorts of ways. I'd need a therapist to get to the bottom of it. but certainly, I think the fact that it's a city that had, at least to my knowledge, 4 great theatres: the Taibhdearc, the Town Hall, the Black Box, and the McLally Druid Theatre. That was enormously influential to me. And Tom Murphy, I think, is from Galway, and he was very influential as well. I can't answer the question in any kind of a succinct way, but just to say a lot.
Yeah. We have another one from Galway. This is from Dylan in Galway. What's the importance of humour when discussing very serious subjects such as the 2008 financial crash?
That's a good question. I think, I don't know. I haven't read any studies about national pathologies and humour, but I do think that looking at the history of Irish literature, in particular, writers like Oscar Wilde and Beckett and Flann O'Brien, and then more contemporarily, is that a word? Marina Carr and people like that, and then so many people in fiction. But just thinking, I guess I'm still in the kind of theatre mode of thinking. They all kind of use humour in their writing, and it doesn't really matter the subject, or it helps. Humour is kind of a way of still a story being worth telling and a life being worth living. Maybe that's to oversimplify it, but I do think that all of the writers that I love reading are funny, and there's a film critic called Mark Kermode who does a really good film review podcast with Simon Mayo, and he talks about the 6 laugh test, and he's talking about comedies, but I kind of think that it applies to books, at least the ones that I like to read. You kind of need to laugh over 6 times over the course of 300 pages, or even if you're only smirking. But no matter what the subject matter is, and I find a lot of things funny. I think Kafka is one of the funniest writers. But then, what role does it have? I think it's very important, because one of the strengths of Irish self-reflection, the self-reflection that's happened in Irish culture, as demonstrated through its literature, has been to be able to laugh at trauma. And if we spend time thinking about trauma, you end up, Toni Morrison talks about being able to enact kind of moral sharpening, or and that can happen, I think, aided by humor. I'm blathering a little bit here. I'm not sure how.
I think it's in the sense that humor comes into Irish literature and theatre and life. It's always the laughter in the dark kind of side of things, isn't it, that comes through. It's how we get through. We have one more. I think it's from Claire. It could be Clara. I can't read my own writing. She says, what advice would your narrator Hart give to people who are living through the COVID pandemic and the financial difficulties that it's bringing? What would Clark Hart say to us to help us get through? Oh my
goodness. Wow. Well, I mean, I don't think Hart would be one to give advice to other people. I think, he'd probably listen to people's advice and disparage it. But I actually don't think he would give advice. He'd probably just maybe buy you a pint. But I suppose maybe you're asking me. I don't know. And in that case, I don't know. I live with an environmental scientist, and it's very hard to ever think that things are okay. So weirdly, at the start of this pandemic, it actually felt like, and this is also wrong to say, but it was partly true, that it was kind of a relief that you could see people coming together to halt the inertia of untenable ways of life. And that's not to say that the response to the realities of the climate are that people would need to no longer go to work and no longer go to discos and no longer to fly around the place. It's that it's going to take that much of it's going to feel equivalently large in the restructuring of our lives and in our politics and our policies. And so it felt it can be really the least hopeful you feel, I think, that I've witnessed environmental scientists feel, is when they see people being seeming to be unmovable in their habits and in what they expect, what they take as a right, a freedom, and so the fact of this new consciousness that we are actually a species in collaboration with one another. And that we kind of need to become, if we want to evolve and move in a positive direction, becoming more and more cognizant of that, it can only be a good thing. So I found try not to let it depress you too much, because and that's again not to belittle all of the grief that's being suffered, but it might enable changes that otherwise are devastating.
I guess it's very early. It's such early days with it all, isn't it, as well? I mean, we don't know how it's going to change. For example, the way we're inclined to tell stories and the way we're inclined to write and make art and music and songs, what it's going to do to that is going to seep slowly in. But at this point, Caoilinn, we'll just say thanks so much for launching the book with us today.
Yeah, I told you I'd end on a gloom. I told you I'd think gloom.
That was hopeful. That was kind of a hopeful note, I think. I just something I have to say is I think that if you go to Dubray's website, there's a code to get a good deal on the book, on The Wild After. Anyway, listen, I hope it gets loads. It's got a rapturous reception so far. I hope it gets loads more, and I hope it gets nods for awards and all that. It really deserves to, Caoilinn, and very best luck with it.
Thank you so much for doing this, and thanks to Court and to Sasha and to Alex and all the people behind the scenes making this work.
Cheers. Thanks.